Welcome to the People's Forum. Welcome back, America. Welcome back. We are now into part four of what's really a five-part series. We've covered most of the entire the book and the text. We even met up last Wednesday at an economic empowerment seminar, a breakfast seminar, which was phenomenal. Packed house. Selling books like you were giving them away. And now we're back here again, and we're into the PhD solutions portion of the discussion. So, without further ado, take it away. Let's go.
Yeah, so that was a great breakfast.
It was.
It was hosted by the Harlem Business Alliance, which was pretty cool. The PhD is a framework to create to attack the jobs and businesses gap, and by virtue of doing that, to be able to attack the wealth gap. And we talked about it previously that those gaps are very, very substantial. PhD stands for purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs and businesses. And I always say, listen, when possible, where possible, do business with high quality black talent, right? When possible, where possible, do business with high quality black products and services. And it's a thing that's very simple. We can start with us, our individual households, in terms of how we are spending money on resources. So at some point, if you need a car, you're going to have 7 to 9 of them over the course of your life. When possible, make sure you look at black auto dealerships, right? On average, I think the average auto dealer has about 66, maybe 70 employees. And those are great paying jobs,
Yes.
right? If you ever had to have your car fixed, not cheap.
$100 an hour.
Right.
Welcome to the BMW world.
Right, there you go, right? So that's something that's powerful, and that's really the amongst the largest spend, right, that we do in our community. As we're buying homes, and that is a clear, critical part of the American dream. We should always be thinking, are we involving black realtors in those transactions?
Realtors, contractors,
Right? That's just in
title
a home
companies.
purchase, yeah, a
Exactly.
portion of it, right? And in addition to that, we have to have insurance. Do we take a look at, black insurance providers? Again, these are really, really great jobs that are here in the U.S. and going to stay here. Those are not going to be exported anyplace else. And if we utilize black realtors in our transactions, even just the homes we're buying now, right? Not the many, many more that we actually need to have to be on parity, you'd need to hire another 14,000 or so realtors, terrific jobs full time. These things are really, really critical. When you start thinking about people are in a position with any financial advice, well, who is your financial advisor? Less than 2% of all financial advisors are black, right? When you're thinking about the accounting services that you need or the tax services, there are a lot of terrific professionals that are out there that can do a really great job, but very often we're not thinking about it.
I have a question in terms of that because some of these key components, like you said, the home, the automotive, and the banking component, I've found that I met most of those people in college. Like my relationship with my banker, with my real estate agent, those are relationships that I forged early on in my late teens, early 20s. Is it because we're not, populating the colleges in terms of those numbers? Why we don't make those acquaintances? What is it? Why are
Well,
we doing business outside in those key areas?
there's a couple of things, but I think one of the really largest problems and drivers is the level of bias that we have
Even ourselves.
absolutely. So the bias levels, and when I talk about bias levels, I'm talking about anti-black bias levels. And there's also something called automatic white preference, which is a really nice way of saying your lack of interest in doing business with black enterprise.
Please
That,
discuss how that's programmed. And this is not whites showing anti-black bias towards us. This is us showing a pro-white preference.
Yeah, well, it's both that's happening. So, at first you have to get a sense of like what does the data say about the bias levels, right? And there are studies that say, you know, the explicit, like people know what they're doing levels are, you know, pushing 50 to 60%, right, of the population. There are others that put those numbers from the subconscious, right, and the same kind of level. If you look at the work that Harvard has done, and they have this thing called the IAT, is the associate, why am I spacing on this name? So it's the automatic association test. Thank you. It's a terrific test. You can go online. It's pretty quick, and it will tell you like your level of like racial bias. It's pretty awesome. Over 3 million people, I think 3.4 million people have taken that test, and based on that sample, you know, it's like 75% or so, right, of Americans have a subconscious bias, right, and they call it an automatic white preference, which is a really nice way of saying anti-black bias, right? Now, that's the population. That includes black people, right? And part of the problem is like our bias often shows up in commerce. And we've, you know, we would have these conversations, you know, we systematically choose people who aren't really us. You have a problem of, we have small numbers to begin with, so your frequency of impacting or coming across these businesses are lower, but then you also have an automatic bias against them and a preference for someone else, right? And that's a very, that's a significant problem. That we need to deal with, and part of it is to understand that it exists, and then to start talking about how do we begin to shift that. And part of the work that I do in the book is to help people understand that there is real cost to this, financial costs and costs in terms of, you know, employment associated with this and wealth, so that they can take a concerted effort to say, okay, I can affect change in terms of how I spend, right? So that's why I say people aren't acting in nefarious ways. Sometimes, right? It's sometimes it's subconscious, sometimes it's conscious. So that's playing out in a lot of these things. So, so again, the idea is let's make people aware that this thing exists. The levels are significant. Let's also make them aware of the reason why it makes a lot of great, terrific sense to do business with our great businesses that are currently there, which is going to create jobs and economic opportunities within our communities. A lot of people that become exposed to the information, but which they weren't, say, wow, okay, I can do that. You know, I can
Even
make
on
sure.
a personal level.
Yeah, you can start with you before you start requiring everybody else to do things that we don't do ourselves, right? And again, the level of spend is like 2% of total black spend on black businesses. It's tiny, right? That has to change. There's no win if that is maintained. So, you know,
That's something we almost have to teach from home through pre-K and all the way through. This has to start with, you know, the grandparents, you know.
Yeah, it starts with us as individuals, and just kind of branching out to others who are interested in having the conversation and the dialogue. Right. At the end of the day, we get to control our spend, and that's really important. And we can influence other people's spend. We can say, listen, if you're excited about and value and engaged in economic advancement, creation of those things within the black community, the way you do it is through your spend as well.
Well, playing devil's advocate, what do you say to the person who says, well, I don't have a black-owned supermarket in my neighborhood. There's a food desert. I don't have a black-owned dry cleaners. I don't have these things, you know, in my immediate surrounding, and it would be a hardship to drive 45 or 50 minutes, you know, just to do that. It would cost me more than the actual transaction. What do you say to that?
I would say that's a very real and serious concern and problem. And there's a couple different ways to look at that. One is, first is to affect the demand for it. Because we can put those things in place and people still not use them, right? So, and that the bias can play into that. So first is to encourage a demand for it, so that when the businesses are there, that people will be doing commerce with them. The second piece of it is now we're having broader conversations among the the local governments that are responsible for those areas, right, and the private sector to say, this is critical. There's a demand for it. It creates jobs and neighborhood stability and advancement. Can we invest in ways to help create jobs here? Because people want to do that and they can't get the capital to do it.
Exactly.
Right?
I had the pleasure of meeting a mother-son team from Detroit. And Detroit, in that inner city, that inner harbor area, they have a massive revitalization going on. But there's also a concerted effort to find locals, especially black locals, and they're doing a dollar for dollar match, and in many cases, a full out funding of these businesses, as long as you have a sound business plan and it fits into into their scope.
Yeah, so that sounds fantastic, right? It sounds like they're acting in a way to create jobs and businesses in the community. It's super critical, right? Because it actually lowers overall cost when you do that, because you don't need all the other ancillary supports that you do when you deprive a community economically. That's terrific, That's something I'd like to learn more about and study and see how well that's working, because maybe people are working on replicating that in other places. The other thing I always say is when possible, where possible. So the example you gave me about the supermarket was, at that time, it wasn't really possible because it didn't exist. Are there other services that can be used, right? And if so, let's try to utilize those as we work on bringing more products and services into those communities and getting people around that. So the Detroit example, people established funding, because that's a critical
Key
issue,
component.
right? They established funding. A lot of communities, no one has done that. People have to do that from their own coffers, what they have saved up for themselves or their friends and family. And if you're from a deprived area, those amounts are low. Now, if you're going to a bank to get those resources, black businesses have higher rates of denial, and they have higher interest rates associated with lending, all things being the same, right? So the cost of capital is much higher. So, these are things that are really, really critical. So if you can't get the capital, or if it costs you more, which means your profits are less, then that is undermining your likelihood of success. And these are the things that we need people to understand and be aware of, that these things are happening. They are happening. Some of it is happening and it's intentional. Some of it is happening and it is not intentional. These people don't know what they're doing, and this isn't what they mean to do. But the issue is, it's still occurring, and something needs to happen. We cannot starve businesses of capital when they're driving employment, who are now putting money into families, right? And communities are based on families.
I have a question. We have about 2.5 minutes left, and I've heard a couple of different people speak to this, but I'm really concerned about your opinion. If I'm a 18 or 19-year-old and I have aspirations of starting a business, I don't want to go to college. I really don't want to go to community college. College wasn't my thing, but I'd like to start a business. Do you think in our community it makes more sense to take that $100,000 investment and invest in that young person in a business, or push that person towards higher education and or school without a business?
That's a very general kind of question. So I don't have a lot of specifics on that individual and their family, community, neighborhood, right? Because different people have different economic supports around them. There are folks who can make that decision, and their families will subsidize them the whole way. There are folks who are not in a position to make that decision and be able to survive. So if you're coming from a family of more limited means, your first step has to be able to increase your skill set and your capabilities so you can be compensated at a much higher level, and then be able to save and retain as much as your income, because most entrepreneurs, right, are self-funded. The initial funding is coming from themselves and their families, so on and so forth. So I would say to do that first. The other thing is a significant number of entrepreneurs spent considerable time in industry. developing skills.
Developing skill
There's a
set.
lot of great
Yes.
things that can happen from being there that can help you become an even better entrepreneur, or even help you realize whether or not that path is for you. So I need a little more specifics around that situation
Okay.
to be able
When,
to
when we
advise
come
more
back,
so.
I'll get back into it and I'll give you the specific commercial I'm talking about, but they're talking to me upstairs. So we'll be right back.
I see you mobbing over her. Let's go. Let's mob. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Hey yo, we mobbing. Come on, girl. Let's crawl. Hey yo, let's crawl. Hey yo, let's crawl. Hey, let's crawl. Hey yo, let's crawl.
Okay, Sean, we're back and we're going to kill this last 15 minutes and specifically target solution-based ideas for our community. So please take it away.
So so there's a couple different things. Let's just start. The first part is, what can we control ourselves? And we talked a little bit about our ability, when possible, where possible, to make sure that we're using, high quality Black talent and products and services in our household, in our businesses, so on and so forth. I think it's important that we encourage, people that we interact with, that we do business with, and who represent us in different areas, especially politics, to also understand this notion of a PhD. The way you demonstrate the solidarity is by making sure that we're represented on the payroll, making sure that we're represented in the supply chain, right? Let's focus on the actions that we can take to create jobs and businesses. To what extent can we put money in our financial institutions so that they have the resources to lend to businesses, right, and to consumers who are actually trying to achieve the American dream? Let's make sure that that's part of the solution. From a politician standpoint, they're coming, they're looking for your vote, and it's fantastic. You want to give them your vote, and let's talk about what their plan is for PhD, right? And what does that look like? Because that's really critical. I mean, do we want to deal with the symptoms, or do we want to deal with the real problems, right? And the problems have been and always have been related to jobs and businesses, right? A lot of disenfranchisement flows from the lack of those things. There is also, what we can do as individuals to prepare for the resources that are coming and are always coming, right? And how do we manage our own resources to the highest and best use? So one of the things that we did is to write this book, The Black Tax, that informs people about the financial cost of discrimination and a way to address those things through the creation of jobs and businesses in our community. The other piece of it is about how do we manage our resources as individuals and as families and households in a much more robust way. Because we haven't had the opportunity, because of a lot of this historical trauma, to accumulate that critical mass of knowledge. And I have another book that's coming out, and it's called CPR for the Soul. You know, how to.
That was just on the screen. Can we have that back up on the screen, please, so the audience can see it? Here we go.
Which is called, you know, CPR for the Soul. And one of the things that we talk about there is SOUL is an acronym for Stewardship, Ownership, and Legacy, right? And the idea is stewardship is about how do you manage your limited resources to their highest and best use to drive cash flow? Because cash flow is critical to every conversation, every goal, everything, right? The O is for ownership, which is how do we maximize ownership? And that's really difficult to do when we live in a society that's fueled and driven by debt. And where you have to encounter debt to just do the simplest things. To get a college education very often requires that you're getting engaged in debt.
Yes.
To purchase a home, to furnish the home, so many different things, right?
All
To
linked to
clothe
debt and credit.
ourselves, exactly. Becomes really problematic. And do we have a plan in place and a framework to make sure that we're constantly minimizing that and driving it to a zero point so we actually own the resources that we have? Because now we've been, what happened is we have been encouraged to misplace possession and ownership in terms of our thinking. So now people possess things and they speak in terms of owning it. And you don't own it, right? And what's happened is they've allowed us to possess things prior to actually paying for it.
Exactly.
And the difference is the debt that you
They've
have
allowed
on
us
it.
to just rent with an option.
Right, and what we want to do is full ownership. And then the other portion of it is really thinking from a legacy mindset. And once you start thinking that way, man, it changes your thinking. Because if you're like, how do I make sure that I have resources there from like my children's children?
It requires you to have a plan in place,
It- it-
and it requires you to be disciplined. You know, like
Absolutely.
you said, exercise stewardship. You have to make that promise, and you have to have it in place, and you have to be disciplined.
Right, and the issue is not to chastise people about those things, but it's to really just show them how you go about doing it. Because we already have a great desire to leave legacy, right? It might be tough to talk to, you know, a gentleman about less budgeting because it's not like super awesome, exciting subject. But if you talk about legacy, people are right there with you, right? You know, there are people who might be less interested in talking about debt elimination, but if you're talking about the reason that's important is because you can maximize the legacy that you will leave, that's critically important. And then a lot of us are very generous and like to be generous, like giving is a part of what we do. And if you want to be able to do that in a robust way, that actually has to be part of your plan, right? And how do you go about doing that? So we do that we have online courses that are, you know, professionally done, and we use PhD,
Okay.
right?
All right.
to create those courses. Terrific sister down in Atlanta produced those, you know, for us. And it really takes people through the process, the paradigm shift, because if you want different actions, you have to have different thinking. And then how do you go about doing it? But in a way that makes you say, wow, a way that provides clarity. Because I like to give people what I like, which I don't want pie in the sky. I want something that I can execute tomorrow. And
But it has to be a lifestyle change.
Right.
It's, you know, it's not, like you said, it's not a short fix. This is a long-term thing, and you change your lifestyle. And once I guess you adapt it, you know, culturally,
Right.
you know, you're able to hand that down.
Yeah, so it's a lifestyle change. You have to have a compelling reason to change your lifestyle, right? That normally there's something like that. The other thing is I try to tailor it to our particular needs. It applies to anyone, right? But a lot of financial advice and solutions are tailored to what I would call the allocation of resources. So I have X dollars or resources. How do I put that in different places so I can like diversify it and maximize investments in the future? Terrific for people who have significant resources. For many of us, the issue really has been, how do I accumulate those resources? And it's not a lot of focus that's been spent on that. And that's where we spend, you know, the vast majority of our time. How do we use our limited resources, our incomes, to be able to accumulate resources that puts us in this position so that we're ready for this journey? And it's just a matter of explaining things in just a powerful and profound way, and taking things that are mundane and not sexy and making them like, wow.
But I mean, success is sexy. everybody wants to be part of a winner. I mean, and like you said, if this is something that we introduce into a community, when my neighbor sees me, you know, they say, well, hi, how'd you do that? You know, how did you pay for that new swimming pool? How did you put that $10,000 fence up? You know, what are you doing, you know, that's stimulating all of these, you know, improvements? And
So, like, part of it is we we often don't share successes
oh no, it's a
with
secret.
our neighbors and our friends and people in our community and our churches, right? And we need to do that. Like, we need to explain the how behind it. So, because we kind of operate on these little islands, and our suffering is on the island, and our joys are on the island, but other people are going through those situations. There's so many wonderful things that people have learned to put themselves in great positions. You know, like, I take people through, like, the car buying process. Why? Because, you know, we buy 5 million cars a year, right? You spend almost $100
And
billion.
like you said, at least 7 in a lifetime for the average
Right. So
person.
it's a big deal. And it's emotional, right? Like, cars are sexy and they project a lot. But, you know, we can wind up paying a lot more than we otherwise should. It can be a huge drain. And there are a lot of people who are walking around paying really high interest rates on cars, 28, 30%, things that are mind-boggling. But were they in a position to know that they could get a much better deal than that and be able to save those resources? A lot of times people aren't. And to share those keys, you know, how do you kind of make sure you're in the best position possible? And those are things that we do, the power of credit and understanding it, right? Like, people know they're supposed to pay your bills. Like, that's a hustle if you tell people, yo, you should pay your bills on time. They know it. What they often don't know is the consequence
Of not paying
of not
their
paying
bills.
on time. You or me might not think it's a big deal. They think it's a really big deal. And it's going to move the numbers against you dramatically in a very short period of time. And once people get a sense of that, then they say, okay, wow.
Shawn D. Rochester, the time has gotten away from us again, as usual. Whenever we have these talks, it's like we're on the phone and we're just talking for hours and hours and hours. Thank you for coming. I want to really shake your hand. We
Thank you for
really
having me.
appreciate you. I'm going to take this last minute to reflect on a very, very dear friend, Miss Shirley Pearl Foy of Fayetteville, North Carolina. Could you bring the camera down so we could get that in the monitor, please? This morning, about 11 a.m. or so, we got the call that she had transitioned, and she was a matriarch. She was a family rock. She lived in the Butler houses for the better part of the last 25 or 30 years, and my heart goes out to that family, and we're going to miss her. She was somebody that I grew up with her. I knew her. You know, I've known her since I was 27 years old, and she's going to be missed, and, you know, she's going to be missed. She loved kids. She took every kid in to her home, and she gave us a great example. So Shirley Foy of Fayetteville, North Carolina, we thank you. We thank you for coming and spending this time with us. We thank you for raising your children here. We thank you for selling. She was a businesswoman. She sold trinkets in front of the building, and we just thank you for being you. Going to miss you and going to see you again soon. Love. Good night.